Hi, I'm Anthony Marinelli. I've been programming synthesizers for feature films, for commercials, and for records for the last 40 years. So today I thought it would be a good time to show you some of my favorite tips when programming bass sounds, because bass sounds, are very fussy, and I think these tips will really help you deliver. They'll help you deliver a personality to your sound. There's no reason why you have to have this ARP 2600 at your fingertips. You should be able to apply these tips to any VST that you have, plug in or reissue hardware synthesizer, or pretty much any synthesizer that's an analog subtractive type of synthesizers with oscillators, filters, VCAs, envelope generators. So I hope you can enjoy it. I'm going to move around today and show you the tips on different instruments so you can see how they can be applied in that kind of way. I've got 10 tips for you. Let's go. Synth bass tip number 1. I learned this from my synth teacher in the later 70s, actually 1976. And he taught me that synthesizers will go out of tune on their own. So he told me to always tune the oscillators. I picked this synthesizer because it's very difficult to get this one in tune, and we're all going to face this one day. You're going to have a synth that you just can't get it locked in tune. So let me show you what's going on here. Oscillator 1. Oh, I love the sound of these filters. Let's get that resonance down so we can hear the actual pitch, even though I love these filters. So bringing in oscillator 2 now to tune it, and you're going to watch me struggle. Oscillator 2 pitch, you hear it's kind of in tune. It's perfectly in tune until I take my hand off of the knob, in tune, hand off knob, drifting. So the point is, get it as in tune as you possibly can, and then you have a great sound. I never try to detune them. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't a good sound to be gotten if you really want to use detuned oscillators. But I would suggest favoring one oscillator over another, and I would also suggest maybe using 3. So you can have like the center frequency locked in tune, and then one oscillator a little bit lower in pitch, detuned down, and another oscillator detuned up a little bit. And that's kind of similar to what's called a Wyoming tuning on a piano. For piano players that like to play ragtime and honky-tonk piano, you can get your piano tuner to do that, because a piano has 3 strings. It's kind of like 3 oscillators. And they'll take the lower string and tune it down a little bit, and the upper string tune it up a little bit. You have your center frequency, so you can kind of be in tune and play with other instruments, but you get a fat sound that way. So if you really want to go out of tune, you might want to use 3 oscillators, but don't have them all at equal level, or you just don't have like a center frequency. I'm sitting at the Jupiter 8 synthesizer, getting ready to tell you about tip number 2. It has to do with the stability of your bass sound. And the way I get around when you have 2 oscillator bass sounds, the way I get around them from not phasing, where you start to hear like a lot of buildup of frequency and then like nothing, like the waveforms start to cancel each other out, is I'll favor one oscillator over the other. And by favoring, all I'm doing is just having more volume of that one oscillator. So let me give you an example. I have a 2 oscillator bass sound right now. This is oscillator number 2. It's a sawtooth. Oscillator number 1. It's a pulse wave, and I'm modulating the pulse wave with the envelope generator. So the pulse width is changing over time. I'll try the Thriller line. That's one oscillator, and here's the other one. sawtooth. So if I put them together, great. But listen to what happens. Certain notes are fuller. Here, it's getting thin right there. Now it's getting fat. Getting thin. Getting fat. So depending on when you're playing the part, you might get a thin note or a fat note. So I don't want thin notes when I'm playing bass. So what I do to kind of compensate is favor one oscillator over the other by raising the volume. So you'll see, like, I have oscillator 1 and 2. I'm favoring oscillator 1 a little bit more. So you can hear both oscillators are in there because it doesn't just sound like this. Hear how flat that is? Both are in there, but I'm favoring oscillator 1, and I'm repeating the notes so you can hear that it's not phasing nearly as much. So when you want to make a bass sound, let's say you want to make a 2 oscillator bass sound because you want one of them to be an octave lower than the other. Now I have 2 octaves. I can favor 1. Now it's in octaves. Let's get it in tune. And there we go. So I'll favor 1. A lot more solid. And I still have the nice rich pulse width, but I get the benefit of having upper octave. And if I wanted to favor the upper octave, just bring in some low, but keeping mostly upper. I just try to stay away from the equal balance where you can potentially get thin bass notes. So that's synth tip number 2. Favor one oscillator when you have more than one playing at the same time. So for tip 3, I'd like to show you my choice of waveform. So we're going to go to an oscillator, and you have, with subtractive synthesis, which is what most analog synths are, all the old stuff is subtractive synthesis, where you have a waveform and then you filter them down. You have a choice of usually a sine wave, a triangle wave, a square wave, which could be a variable pulse wave, and when it's at a 50% duty cycle, it's a square wave, and I can explain that in a little more detail in a second. And a sawtooth wave, which is a lot of times the go-to waveform because it has all the frequencies in the overtone series decaying linearly, so it's a very smooth and bright waveform. But for bass, my favorite waveform is a sine wave. Now, a sine wave is just going to be all fundamental, super low, like when you hear somebody drive by in their car and it's just booming, you know. So I love bass, and so I like using sine waves. But if you just have a sine wave with your synth sound, it's probably going to be too boomy, and you're not going to get enough articulation so that you can hear like all the notes if you're actually trying to play a line and not just doing like a big boombox sound. So I like to start with a square wave because a square wave has the most kind of sine wave content in it because it's skipping overtones in the overtone series. So you're just getting the fundamental and then the third overtone and then the fifth and the seventh and all the way up odd overtones. Whereas with a sawtooth waveform, you're going to be getting all the overtones. So you don't get as much focus on the fundamental. So I'm going to let you hear the difference. So I'll start with a sawtooth. So I'm just using this synthesizer, you know, to give you an example, but you can certainly use any synthesizer. So these waveforms are all available on any analog synthesizer. So starting with a sawtooth, I'm going to patch it into the filter. This is the filter input. And I'm going to open the filter, and I'm going to open the mixer. Let me patch it so that you can see what I'm doing. The filter output is going to the mixer, and then I'm going to patch it below, raise the fader. So I have a low tone, so let me play a higher note. Get rid of the vibrato. So now you can hear, right, this is a great example of what a bad patch chord sounds like. Let's switch patch chords. Now we have special patch chord from Rob Rosen at Rosen Sound. Get good patch chords. You don't need crackle in your sound. So, sawtooth sounds kind of familiar if you've worked with synths. Now I'm going to switch it. The same oscillator giving you a square wave. You hear how much more fundamental there is in that sound? Sawtooth, very bright, but kind of thin compared to a square wave. Now how do you know if it's a square wave? Well, listen to the difference when I'm not square. You hear it get edgy? That's square. Very round. Edgy. Now go to the left. Edgy. Square. Edgy. Square. So you can really hear that hooty sound. That's a square wave. And that's going to deliver, in my opinion, the best low frequency bass sound. Now, the next step that you can take is to modulate this pulse width with some type of controller. I like to use the actual envelope of the sound. So I'm going to go to the ADSR envelope generator. I have a kind of a long decay, and I'm going to take that and go into the pulse width modulation input on oscillator 2, and I'll let you hear that. Without the pulse width modulation, it just sounds like a square wave. But when you have pulse width modulation, it almost sounds like two oscillators. So you have a solid pitch, you don't get the phasing of using two oscillators, and you get the shred of a changing waveform. So it's like two oscillators, but it's a solid pitch. Another way to go is to not use the envelope. Let's say you want that envelope to do its thing, but you want to get a little more of like a chorusing effect. So I'm going to take a low frequency oscillator. I have one on my keyboard, a low frequency sine wave. So if I'm going to put a lot of amount, I'll probably want to run it at a slow frequency. You hear that chorusing? Without it. It's like dead compared to hearing with the chorusing. And it's just a slow sine wave. Now, as I increase the speed, I'm probably going to want to lower the amount. So, using a square wave will give you a nice round fundamental and enough upper harmonics so that you can cut through the track. And if you want to get something fatter and still use one oscillator, use pulse width modulation, and you can use an envelope generator at the shape of the sound, or you can use a low frequency waveform, sine wave, or any other waveform, even like a square wave. And if you wanted to get that in time with your track, you can maybe synchronize it, and then you get sort of like a side chaining chorus on your bass. Moving on to tip number 4, it's one of my favorites because it emulates the sound of a classic synthesizer, the Yamaha CS80, and actually all the CS series synthesizers. I have a CS30 as well as the CS80, but I believe that all the CS synthesizers allow you to do this. But you can add a sine wave from the same oscillator. So essentially, you don't get phasing. You're not really using two oscillators, and you don't have to tune them, but you just get this added boost. And I'm looking forward to showing you this because it's a dramatic difference. So I'm going to use oscillator 2 from the ARP 2600, starting with the sawtooth waveform output. Audio input goes here in the bottom, and then you raise the fader. And then I have the envelope generator controlling the filter. I'm going to do all this patching so you can see what's really going on here. And then the filter goes to the mixer. Okay, so there's a sawtooth bass. Now I'm going to do the trick. Grab a sine wave from the same oscillator, so I don't have to retune it or anything like that, and listen to what happens. Now I'm going to make the whole thing brighter. Now if I take the main sawtooth out and I just have the sine wave, you kind of don't have any definition. You have a great bass sound, but you're not going to really hear a line that cuts through the track. So you need the sawtooth. I'm going to filter it down a little. But without the sine now that you're getting used to it, listen to how thin that sounds. Once you get used to that sine wave, and it's everything, because when you hit those low notes and you have the sine wave, you have real bass. So the key to this is getting your sound just right with the one oscillator, and if you wanted to use a square wave, then you certainly can do that. Let's patch the square wave in. So it already has some nice low end, but then I'm going to add sine wave to that. There you go. And without the square wave will give you definition. Without the sine wave. So that's tip number 4. Add a sine wave from the same oscillator if you can. If you can't get a sine wave from the same oscillator, go ahead and get a sine wave from another oscillator and you can still get that fundamental. But what I would do is, you'll see in tip number 2 how you favor one oscillator, so you will avoid chorusing and you'll be able to get a really solid tone by favoring one oscillator, and you'll see that in tip number 2. Here we go with tip number 5. The envelope generator parameters are extremely important, especially the sustain and the release. So if you're talking about an ADSR envelope generator, it's the S and the R. ADSR, attack, decay, sustain, and release. And I'll show you why. If you have a typical bass sound that just decays, let's say it's kind of a squirty bass. When I play the high note, it dies. If I give it a little sustain while I'm still holding it down, there's something there. Now it doesn't really affect the sound. It still sounds about the same, but it gives me something to grab onto when I don't want the sound to decay. If I want it to decay, I could just... It decays because I release my finger off the key. But if I want to hold the note, it allows me to do that just with this little bit of sustain. So I'm not talking about a lot, where it's just changing the sound. I'm talking about you got this plucky bass, and then it dies, and I want the option to have something there. So it doesn't take very much because it's a bass sound. You just need a little bit of sine wave in there, and that's what it's allowing to happen. The other critical controller is the release time. So you'll see if I add release time, I have to add it to the VCA as well on the Prophet. So there's no way to bypass it. So now I'll play the sound. Very different than this. But if you were to be triggering the bass, for instance, let's say you have sort of a repeated one, you might need a little bit. See the difference? No release time, even though the sound is a short sound. Let's get that out. If I have no release time, get that. And the release time now is giving me the sustain. So it's really having to do with sustain, and there's two ways to get it. One is using the actual sustain, and the other is using the release time to kind of keep the volume level up after you release the note. So for repeated notes, the release function becomes really important. Get it to where I like it. So I have attack, but I have sustain. And without the release again, I have a very percussive, clipped sound. So when you're making bass sounds, have a look. Once you've finished the sound and you're happy with it, make sure you can perform it in every kind of way. And sometimes just by giving yourself a little release or giving yourself some sustained voltage out of the ADSR envelope generator, you'll be able to articulate the sound in more ways. Time for tip number 6. Tip number 6 has to do with keeping the sound contained. And what I mean by that is when you play a certain range on the keyboard, it can get brighter or duller depending on how you have your keyboard control voltage tracking set. So what is keyboard control voltage? Well, the keyboard puts out voltage that controls the different aspects of a synthesizer. It'll control pitch, so when you play a certain note, there's a higher voltage and the note will go up. And when you play other notes going down, the keyboard's putting out less voltage, so then the notes will be lower notes. Same thing with the filter. It's kind of a hidden thing that's going on, but the filter is also tracking. See how it's getting brighter? And it's tracking as you go up. The keyboard it could be sending voltage to the filter, not just to the oscillator. So you have to look and find where does that exist on the synthesizer. So if I'm wondering where the keyboard tracking is to the oscillator, then I would look at the oscillator. If I'm wondering where the keyboard tracking is being sent to the filter, I'm going to look at the filter. So we happen to be on a mini moog right now. So oscillator, mixer, filter. So let's see. Keyboard control. So I have 2 switches on here. And it looks like the keyboard control voltage is divided into thirds. So the first switch will be 1/3 keyboard control voltage. So as I go up the keyboard, let me show you the difference. So listen how much brighter it is. Somewhat brighter. So if I have a bass part, right? And I have it right now, it goes as opposed to different. Keyboard control voltage tracking 2/3 is going to be really bright. Even brighter down there. You hear how bright it is compared to? Much brighter. And if you have both switches in, the way the mini moog divides it up, 1/3, 2/3. So if you add both switches, you have 1/3 plus 2/3. Now it's tracking at 1 volt per octave. So it's going to be super bright, even down here, compared to none, which is the sound I prefer for bass. So I would have to compensate with my envelope generator that's controlling the filter. I can bring it down so I still have a plucky bass, but when I go up high, it's going to be super bright as opposed to no keyboard control voltage. Full keyboard control voltage. So my tip is to be aware of how much keyboard control voltage is being sent to the filter, and I usually like to have none when I play a bass sound, because if you ever listen to an electric bass player, when he goes up high, it's not really that bright. The lower notes are actually brighter on a bass, and the upper notes are a little more dull. And if you need the upper notes, if you're part is moving around in the upper register a lot, I would add maybe a little, like a third. But most of the time, the bass sounds that I've made on albums, there's almost no keyboard control voltage. So it's an important tip because you'll always sound like a bass that way, and you'll have more power. When you go up higher, you won't be like getting too bright and losing the fundamental on the bass. And that's tip number 6. Watch out for the keyboard tracking so that when you play high notes on the bass, they stay powerful. Let's move on to tip number 7. Tip number 7, use the real-time controllers on the synth to give the bass more personality. Stuff you've heard all the time. Pitch bend, vibrato, and some portamento, which the mini mode calls glide. So essentially you're just not getting to the note immediately. It's lagging the keyboard control voltage so that it slides between notes. And you get a nice personality compared to octaves. And you want to time it. If that's the speed of my track, that's none. If I have too much, you know, no pitch. Get it just right, and it slaps. It's kind of like slap bass on synth. Vibrato. So those are like my 3 go-to, effects, let's call them, control, like performance effects. So you can imagine, you can mix them. And I have the glide going the whole time. Another one that I like to play around with sometimes is like doing nothing more than just moving the filter cutoff frequency. So different combinations make your instrument more expressive. And if you can hook up a pedal to your synth, then maybe you can get the brightness to happen, and then you still have a hand free to control the mod wheel and the pitch wheel. So incorporating these performance effects into the bass sound will give it a lot more personality and help it speak through the track. Let's move on to tip number 8. So getting on to tip number 8. A lot of the personality of the bass has to do with how you play it. So I've broken it down into 2 really simple factors. One is short notes and the other is long notes. So with a bass, you can certainly just hold the bass note, like a bass player will just hold the note. That's a long note. And then a short note is going to be like slapping it or just something like muted, percussive. So with a synth bass, if you just only deal with those 2 options, you can cover a lot of ground. So I have the Thriller bass patch on here, and I'm going to show you one of the characteristics of how that bass sound is played. So what do you notice? Long, 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 short, short. Long, long, short, short. Long, 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 short, short. Instead of what a difference, right? And that's going to be true of pretty much any kind of a bass sound that, you want to play. Long, short, short, instead of long, 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 or. So sometimes if you have MIDI, firing your sound, if you don't make sure that your gate length is open all the way, you may end up with, and everything's going to be kind of machine gunning out. So that's why hand-played parts, they're naturally going to have more of that articulation. But you can definitely, if you're playing it in the MIDI or being able to go in and fix the MIDI, you can do that. So if you don't have an ARP 2600 and you're just, using your VST or any synth, make sure that you have long notes and short notes in your bass part. Unless it's just a held, bass part all the way, then it's going to be all long notes. And the same thing with a very staccato bass, all short notes. Now another thing that's kind of interesting is that some synthesizers have something called single trigger and another thing called multiple trigger. I'm going to show you now what it sounds like in single trigger. So this keyboard has a little switch that allows you to determine whether you're in single trigger mode or multiple trigger mode. So I'm in single trigger mode. So when I play a note and then play a new note without releasing the first note, it phrases. You notice how it doesn't go, it goes. So I can phrase a line. As opposed to I can phrase. And if I put it into multiple trigger mode, it's always going to trigger that note, even if so I can still go long, short, long, short, long, short, but it will articulate each note, as opposed to, hear the difference? Multiple trigger. It's still long, short, but you get the attack on the note each time. So, huge difference. Be aware of articulating when you play, long notes, short notes, legato and staccato, and then making sure that if you're in a single trigger mode, or if your keyboard, let's say you have a mini Moog, that's always a single trigger instrument. You can't even control how it's going to perform. So you're going to always be phrasing, whether you like it or not. So if you don't want that, and if you don't want that and you want to articulate the notes, you're going to have to lift up your finger, or you'll end up with. Examine what you have too, and then your playing style can adapt accordingly. And then, there's different synths. I think on a lot of VSTs, you should be able to go in there and control that. Articulation, key to success, and giving your bass parts a lot of personality. Let's get to tip number 9. So I happen to love guitar pedal effects. I like any kind of effects. I like running synthesizers through reverbs, delays, and lots of guitar effects like distortion, phase shift. You can see I have some old stuff here, but I just do have a big collection of effects pedals. But what I've learned is that by using a mult, which, analog synths, most of them have that, you can duplicate your signal. So you can have 2 of them or 3 of them. So the way the mult works is you have 1 input and 3 outputs on these mults. That's a typical mult. And then I'm able to take 1 signal and listen to the sound straight, and then the other signal to run it through an effects pedal loop. And the reason I do that is so that I don't only have the affected bass sound. I like to have a bass sound that has the effect on it, but that also I can put straight signal in there, and I get a lot of definition back on the sound. Punch, high end, and also the phase shifting that happens when you mix the straight signal back in, you get even more interesting like stereo or effect. And you can balance them. You can run them in mono, or you can split them in stereo. And the advantage of doing that, if you can record 2 tracks at once, is so that if you just don't like the effect later, or you want to change it a little bit, you still have your straight signal. But you're able to track it and hear like a real guitar effect and not have to use a plug-in. So, and the same thing, like when you're using a plug-in, you can get great effects that way too. I still like to run parallel, like real signal with it. So let me give you an example. I have a mixer here. This is the straight signal. Then, with this mixer, I have the affected signal that I'm using this Roland Jet Phaser. So it's kind of a vintage guitar effect that has distortion and phase shift. And I'll let you hear what that sounds like. And I can control the speed. And it's analog, so you can hear it speed up and slow down manually. So, pretty fun bass sound. But if I bring in straight signal, I really like what it's doing. Without the straight, I'm sorry, without the effect, here's what you get. So you can see there's a big advantage of having the effect. Maybe there. Take out the straight. I lose all my bass. So synth tip number 9. What I like to do when I'm using effects pedals in the record process is multi the direct signal. So I have 2 of them, run one path through an effects pedal and the other path, keep it straight, and then balance the 2. Maybe start with the straight signal and bring some effect in. So I have like mostly straight with a little bit of effect. Or the other way around, start with a really affected sound and just get some more definition. Right, bring it in right to where you hear it. No straight, straight. Effects with punch, tip number 9. The number 10 tip for synth bass is an abstract one, and I call it personality. It's something that I think it's worth thinking about during tips 1 through 9. Even if you're not using my tips, anytime you're making any sound, I think personality. Because it's like musicians in a room. They contribute to the song. They have personality. They bring something that's unique. And I think when you're creating instruments, you kind of want to think that way. It's going to help. Every little bit kind of contributes to the whole. So I'll show you what I mean by giving your sound personality. I chose the Synth because it has a bandpass filter, which is kind of unique. So I thought, you know, when I'm making a bass sound, there's all kinds of bass sounds that have a low pass filter, which sounds kind of like this. A smooth sweep from lows to high. But a bandpass filter kind of works in the middle of the sound. And then I added Portamento. Here's more. And I have a expression pedal. So I can get brighter when I want to, and I still have a hand free. So what I'm trying to show you is try different things, find unique components to the sound, perform it in an unusual kind of way, you know, deliver something to the track that maybe isn't there, see if it works. And you always want to have a functional bass, I think, but some of these little, you know, like pitch bends, portamento, opening an unusual sounding filter at the right moment will give your song some personality and, you know, give someone reason to kind of wake up and check you out. So that's what I got for tip number 10, personality. Thank you for following me on social media. I love synthesizers so much, so it's my pleasure to make these videos for you. If you'd like more of these videos, please like and subscribe on this channel.